Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most famous and honestly most misunderstood events in modern history, the Titanic. But we're not just looking at this as some tragic, unavoidable accident. No, we're going to break this down as a completely preventable catastrophe, one driven by, well, human hubris, fatal flaws in hierarchy, and this blind, absolute faith in technology. We're going to dig into the data, the historical logs, and the structural decisions to understand exactly how the unthinkable actually happened.
It really all comes down to this core, baffling question. How does a ship, deemed literally unsinkable by the leading science of its day, turn into a mass grave on its maiden voyage? To figure that out, we need to set a ticking clock. From the second it set sail on April 10th, 1912, right up to the early hours of April 15th, a massive cascade of terrible decisions was already in motion. We're going to deconstruct this disaster piece by piece, minute by agonizing minute, to show you how an engineering marvel became a monument to human arrogance.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, Symbol of Arrogance. You see, before the disaster, there was the dream. And that dream, it was a massive symbol of arrogance. The sheer, unbelievable scale and luxury of the Titanic basically blinded everyone, from the creators to the media, all the way down to the passengers, to the harsh realities of the ocean. To put this into perspective, in today's money, the Titanic cost the equivalent of about $400 million. $400 million! It took 3 whole years to build. It was a giant, measuring 269 meters long and 53 meters high. But the real selling point wasn't just the size, it was the engineering. The hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. The engineers, along with J. Bruce Ismay, the head of the White Star Line, famously claimed that even if 4 of these compartments completely flooded, the ship would stay afloat. The press totally ate it up, running with the idea that not even God could sink the ship. And you know, that absolute, unwavering certainty, that's exactly what set the stage for the tragedy. But here's the thing. That massive investment definitely wasn't shared equally. The ship was essentially a floating representation of extreme class division. For the first-class passengers, some of the wealthiest people on the planet, like John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, it was a literal palace. We're talking grand staircases, glittering chandeliers, swimming pools, squash courts, silk curtains, and expensive French chefs. But deep down, at the very bottom of the ship, in the pitch black where sunlight couldn't even reach, were the third-class passengers. These were largely poor immigrants hoping for a new life in America, crammed up to 8 people in a tiny, single room. They were on the exact same ship, but they were living in entirely different worlds. And as we'll see, that hierarchy proved to be fatal. Moving on to Section 2, Ignoring the Warnings. So, on April 14th, 1912, the ocean was perfectly calm, the sky was crystal clear, and the ship was cruising toward New York. But beneath the surface of this peaceful evening, a fatal sequence of completely ignored communications was unfolding. Let's trace this timeline because it's just agonizing. By 7 p.m., the temperature dropped drastically. Throughout the entire day, the Titanic had been receiving multiple radio warnings from other ships about massive ice fields dead ahead. By 9 p.m., Captain Edward Smith had received at least 7 distinct warnings. 7! Yet the White Star Line wanted headlines. They wanted to reach New York in record time. So the Titanic was speeding through the dark at 22 knots, which is about 41 kilometers per hour. And here is perhaps the most infuriating detail of the whole story. Up in the crow's nest at 10 p.m., the 2 lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were staring into the pitch-black night with their naked eyes. Because of a last-minute staff change back in Southampton, the binoculars were locked in a cabinet and the key was literally nowhere to be found. The absolutely crucial number in this timeline is 37. At 11:30 p.m., without any binoculars, lookout Frederick Fleet suddenly saw a massive black shadow dead ahead. He rang the bell 3 times, shouted into the phone. The order was instantly given to turn the ship and reverse the engines. But remember, this wasn't a bicycle. This was a 52,310-ton behemoth. From the exact moment the iceberg was spotted, the crew had exactly 37 seconds to turn this massive object. 37 seconds. It simply wasn't enough time. Which brings us to Section 3, Collision with Death. The actual strike happened at 11:40 p.m. And crazy enough, up on deck, passengers barely felt a thing. Some folks even started playing with the chunks of ice that fell onto the ship. But down beneath the freezing water, a completely different, horrifying reality was taking shape. Let's walk through what structural failure actually looks like here. The iceberg didn't just hit the ship head-on. Instead, it scraped along the starboard side, creating a series of gashes spanning 90 meters. Now remember those 16 watertight compartments?
The ship could survive if 4 of them flooded. But this scrape, it compromised 6 of them. Water began pouring in uncontrollably. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who was actually on board at the time, rushed down to assess the damage. He did the math right there on the spot and delivered a chilling verdict to the captain. The numbers were undeniable. They had maybe 1.5 to 2 hours left before the entire ship would sink.
Immediately, distress signals were frantically sent out, including the newly adopted SOS, which actually makes this the very first time it was ever used. Just 20 kilometers away was another ship, the Californian. It was so incredibly close that they could actually see the Titanic's distress rockets lighting up the night sky. But the Californian's radio operator had already gone to sleep, and the captain just dismissed the rockets as party fireworks. On the other hand, a ship called the Carpathia, which was 93 kilometers away, heard the call and rushed at full speed to help. The heartbreaking problem? Even at top speed, they were 4 hours away. The Titanic only had 2.
Let's look at Section 4, Truth of the Lifeboats. As the grim realization really set in shortly after midnight, the most infuriating aspect of this entire tragedy began to unfold. Because it wasn't just the iceberg that killed so many people. It was the catastrophic lack of preparation. Consider this devastating number for a second. 20. There were 2,224 people on board, but only 20 lifeboats. Combined, these boats could hold a maximum of 1,178 people. That's barely half the passengers. So why? How does that even happen? Well, the maritime laws of the time were unbelievably flawed. Lifeboat requirements were based on the physical weight, the tonnage of the ship, rather than the actual number of human souls on board. And on top of that, the White Star Line intentionally opted for fewer boats. Why? Because they didn't want to clutter up the deck space. They literally prioritized a nice, open walking area for their first-class passengers over the lives of everyone on board. As you can imagine, the evacuation was pure chaos. Some officers allowed men into the boats, while others strictly, and I mean strictly, enforced a women and children-only rule, even launching half-empty lifeboats into the dark because some passengers just couldn't believe the ship was actually sinking. But amidst all that panic, there were these incredible, heartbreaking micro-narratives of bravery. Where you go, I go. Those were the words of Ida Strauss. She outright refused to get in a lifeboat and leave her husband Isidore behind. They went down with the ship together, holding hands. In the ship's 8 musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, they dragged their instruments onto the deck and just played music, eventually playing the hymn Nearer My God to Thee right up until the very end, just trying to keep people calm. But we have to contrast that beautiful bravery with a horrific systemic failure. Down below, many third-class passengers were quite literally locked behind gates. The strict rules separating the classes were rigidly maintained, even in the absolute face of death, trapping hundreds of poor families below as the freezing water kept rising.
Section 5. The terrifying end. By 2:05 a.m., the very last lifeboat had been lowered. Over 1,000 people were still stranded on a deck that was now tilted at its terrifying angle. We're now entering the final chaotic moments of the Titanic. At 2:17 a.m., with a deafening roar, the sheer weight of the water in the front of the ship caused the massive structure to violently snap right in two. The front section plunged straight down into the depths, while the back half briefly stood totally vertical in the air before sinking into the abyss. Thousands of people were thrown into the pitch-black ocean. And that brings us to a fatal, inescapable reality. -2 degrees Celsius. The water was freezing. I mean, literally below freezing. In temperatures that low, severe hypothermia sets in almost instantly, giving a human body a maximum of maybe 15 minutes to survive. Despite the desperate cries of hundreds of people echoing across the water, out of all those lifeboats floating nearby, only one single boat returned to help. They managed to pull just 6 people from the freezing ocean. The rest? They were just too terrified of being capsized by the desperate crowds in the water. When the Carpathia finally arrived at 4 a.m., they were only able to rescue 705 survivors. Over 1,517 people perished. And honestly, when you look at the survival data, the profound tragedy of the ship's hierarchy becomes completely undeniable. 60% of the first-class passengers survived, 42% of the second class, and a tragic, unacceptable 24% of the third class. Even in the absolute undeniable face of death, societal wealth and class dictated who got a seat on a lifeboat and who was left to drown in the dark. Okay, let's wrap this up with Section 6, Lessons from the Tragedy. The loss of the Titanic wasn't just some freak accident. It was a massive, devastating failure of human systems. But the profound shock of over 1,500 deaths forced the entire world to wake up and completely overhaul maritime operations. And these systemic changes, this was really what you should take away from our explainer today. Because of this totally preventable disaster, international maritime safety laws were completely rewritten. Overnight, it became a strict, non-negotiable legal requirement that a ship must carry enough lifeboats for every single soul on board. No exceptions. Ship radios were suddenly mandated to be manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so a tragedy like the Californian literally sleeping through a distress call would never ever happen again. Plus, the International Ice Patrol was established to constantly track and report icebergs to all passing ships. These are crucial, foundational safety pillars that we still rely on today, unfortunately paid for by the lives lost on that freezing April night. Today, the ruins of the Titanic sit 3,800 meters below the surface of the ocean, slowly being consumed by the sea. It serves as this haunting, rusting monument to the eternal battle between human ego and the overwhelming, undeniable forces of nature. So I want to leave you with this final thought to reflect on. We really like to think we've learned our lesson, right? But if modern science creates a new unsinkable marvel today, whether that's deep in the ocean, out in space, or even in artificial intelligence, will humanity's inherent arrogance ensure that history just repeats itself? Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.